The cold metal floor bit into Lyra's knees as she huddled in the corner of her cage, with her two dragons pressed against her sides, trying to share whatever warmth their small bodies could offer in the freezing station. 3 years had passed since the Kryn Empire burned her forest home and took everyone who survived, and she still remembered the screams of children and the smell of burning trees while her people begged for mercy that never came. Her dragons, Ember and Frost, were tiny hatchlings when the slavers captured them, and now they were bigger but still weak from years of poor food and constant beatings whenever they tried to protect their bonded elf. The slave market on Station 47 was busy today, with buyers from across the sector coming to look at the merchandise, and Lyra had learned long ago to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut, because slaves who made trouble disappeared into the fighting pits. Vex, the Kryn dealer who owned her, walked past her cage and kicked the bars hard enough to make them rattle, and she flinched but didn't make a sound because crying only made him angrier. He was in a good mood today, which meant he had sold several slaves already, and when Vex was happy, he used the shock rod less and sometimes even threw extra food scraps into the cages. Lyra watched through the bars as alien species of every kind walked through the market, buying and selling living beings like they were furniture or tools, and nobody seemed to think there was anything wrong with it. She had tried to understand how the galaxy could be so cruel, but after 3 years she had stopped looking for answers and just focused on surviving one more day. The Galactic Council knew about the slave trade in the Outer Rim, but they never did anything to stop it because the Council only cared about the core worlds where the important species lived. Elves were considered primitive and worthless by most of the galaxy, and when the Kryn invaded, nobody came to help because helping would mean going to war, and war was bad for business. Lyra's people had sent desperate messages begging for aid and promising anything in return, but the replies were always the same, which was that the Council couldn't interfere in local disputes without proof of genocide. By the time they had proof, it was too late, and half her species was dead, while the other half was scattered across the slave markets of a dozen systems. She had given up hoping for rescue after the first year when she realized that nobody was coming and nobody cared, and the galaxy had decided that elven lives simply didn't matter enough to cause problems. A Thalorian merchant stopped in front of her cage today and studied her with cold eyes while calculating her worth, and she stood up slowly because slaves who didn't show themselves got beaten. He walked away after a few minutes without buying, and Lyra sank back down to the floor while her dragons made soft, worried sounds in their throats. The station was busier than usual, and Vex seemed excited about something as he talked with other dealers in hushed voices while glancing toward the main docking bay. Lyra didn't care what excited the slavers because their excitement usually meant more suffering for the slaves, and she had learned to just endure whatever came next. Then everything changed when the humans arrived. She heard them before she saw them, because the crowd in the market went quiet in a way that made her look up from her usual position, staring at the floor. A group of 5 humans walked through the market, and they moved like predators with easy confidence, and hands never far from the weapons on their belts. The leader was a tall woman with dark skin and gray streaks in her black hair, and she wore a long coat that had seen better days, but her boots were good quality, and her eyes missed nothing. Lyra had heard stories about humans from other slaves who whispered about the new species that had joined the galaxy 20 years ago and refused to follow the rules everyone else accepted. The stories said humans were crazy and dangerous and unpredictable, and that they did impossible things that terrified the powerful species who ran the council. She had never seen a human before, and she watched them walk past her cage, expecting them to ignore her like everyone else did. But the woman stopped walking when she saw Lyra and her dragons, and she turned to face the cage with an expression that Lyra couldn't read. The other humans stopped too, and they formed a loose circle facing outward like they were protecting their leader. While she crouched down in front of the cage, Vex hurried over and started explaining in trade language that this particular slave was high-quality elven stock with 2 trained dragons included in the price. The human woman ignored him completely and looked directly at Lyra with dark eyes that seemed to see everything, including all the broken pieces that Lyra tried to hide. "What is your name?" the woman asked in perfect trade language, and her voice was gentle, like she was talking to a real person instead of property. Lyra hesitated because talking without permission got you hurt. But something about this human made her want to answer. "My name is Lyra," she whispered, "and the dragons are Ember and Frost, and we have been here for 3 years." The human nodded slowly and asked how Lyra had been captured and treated, and whether she had family elsewhere. Lyra told her everything, because the words just poured out after years of silence, and the human listened without interrupting, while Vex grew more nervous. When Lyra finished talking, the woman stood up and turned to Vex with a smile that looked friendly, but somehow felt dangerous. How much for all three? The human asked, and Vex laughed because everyone knew humans were soft about slavery. And he quoted a price that was 3 times what Lyra was actually worth. The human pulled out a credit chip and transferred the full amount without arguing, while Vex's face showed shock and greedy satisfaction. He unlocked the cage quickly before the human could change her mind, and stepped back expecting the buyer to put chains on her new property. Instead, the human held out her hand toward Lyra and said, "You are free now and nobody will ever own you again." Lyra stared at the offered hand like it was a trap, because freedom was always a trick that led to worse punishments. But the human waited patiently with her hand extended, and finally Lyra took it and let herself be pulled to her feet while Ember and Frost climbed onto her shoulders. The other humans formed a protective circle around them, and they walked toward the docking bay while the entire market watched. In stunned silence, Lyra kept waiting for the trap to spring. But these humans just guided her onto their ship, and the door closed behind them, and suddenly, she was safe for the first time in 3 years. The inside of the human ship called the Morning Star was nothing like the cold metal cages Lyra had lived in for 3 years, and she stood frozen in the entrance corridor, afraid to move or touch anything. Captain Amy Foster was the name of the woman who had bought her freedom, and she spoke quietly to her crew while Lyra clutched her dragons and waited to find out what humans wanted from slaves they purchased. A younger human with red hair and kind eyes approached slowly with her hands, visible and empty, and she introduced herself as Katie Miller. The ship's medic Katie explained that she needed to check Lyra's injuries and make sure the dragons were healthy, but she promised to be gentle and asked permission before touching anything. Lyra nodded because she had learned that cooperation made things easier, but she flinched when Katie reached toward her arm to examine the scars from the shock rod. The medic pulled her hand back immediately and apologized and asked if Lyra wanted a female crew member to do the exam instead or if she needed more time. That simple question, asking what Lyra wanted instead of just taking, made something crack inside her chest, and she started crying for the first time in years. Katie didn't try to touch her or tell her to stop crying, and instead she just sat down on the floor nearby and waited until Lyra was ready to continue. After the medical exam, which revealed malnutrition and dozens of old injuries that had healed badly, Katie led Lyra to a small private cabin with a real bed and clean blankets. "This is your room," Katie said, "and you can lock the door from the inside and nobody will bother you unless you ask for help." Lyra stood in the doorway staring at the bed, because slaves didn't get beds or privacy or locked doors, and this had to be some kind of test. Katie seemed to understand her confusion, and she demonstrated the door lock and showed Lyra where the bathroom was, and explained that food would be brought 3 times a day. Then the medic left and closed the door behind her, and Lyra was alone with her dragons in a space that belonged to her. She didn't sleep that first night because she kept expecting someone to come take it all away, but nobody came, and eventually, exhaustion claimed her. The next morning, Katie brought food, and it was real food, not scraps, and there was enough for all 3 of them with nothing moldy or spoiled. Lyra ate slowly, waiting for the price to be revealed because nothing was ever free. But Katie just collected the empty dishes and asked if she needed anything else. Over the next few days, Lyra met more of the crew, and she realized with growing shock that most of them were former slaves from different species who had been rescued by humans of Vortan. Male named Chen told her that he had been freed 2 years ago and now worked as the ship's engineer, and he was paid actual wages and treated with respect. An insectoid Clixian, called Zara, explained that humans didn't believe in slavery and considered it one of the worst crimes a species could commit. Lyra asked why the Galactic Council allowed humans to break the laws about slave ownership, and Zara made a chittering laugh and said humans didn't care what the Council allowed. Earth had told the Council very clearly that any government built on slavery would get no trade and no treaties and no respect from humanity. The Council had threatened sanctions and isolation, but humans had just shrugged and continued building their own networks with species who agreed to end slavery. Captain Amy found Lyra on the observation deck one evening and sat down beside her without saying anything at first. Lyra gathered her courage and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the market. Why did you save me when nobody else would? Amy was quiet for a moment, watching the stars stream past before she answered. Humans fought a terrible war on Earth centuries ago, over slavery, and millions of people died before we finally ended it. We learned that you cannot claim to be civilized while treating other beings as property, and we decided we would never forget that lesson. But other species have slavery too, Lyra said, and they seem fine with it. Amy turned to look at her directly, and her eyes were sad but determined. Just because something is common doesn't make it right, and just because everyone else accepts evil doesn't mean we have to. My ancestors were slaves, Lyra, and nobody saved them for generations, and by the time slavery ended on Earth, millions had suffered and died. So we decided that if we ever met other species, we would be the people our ancestors needed, and we would save those who couldn't save themselves. Lyra felt tears running down her face again because someone actually cared that she had suffered and thought her life mattered. The captain handed her a cloth to wipe her eyes and continued talking in that gentle but firm voice. I know the galaxy thinks humans are crazy and dangerous for opposing the slave trade, but I sleep better knowing I tried to help. You don't owe us anything, Lyra. And when we reach Earth, you can choose whatever life you want. But if you want to stay with us and help rescue others, then you would be welcome on my crew. Lyra thought about all the elves still trapped in cages across the galaxy, and all the other species suffering, while the council pretended not to see. She thought about the 3 years she spent believing nobody cared, and nobody would help, and how close she had come to giving up entirely. Then she thought about these impossible humans who crossed the galaxy to save strangers and refused to accept that some suffering was inevitable. I want to help, she said, and her voice was stronger than it had been in years. I want to be part of saving people who have given up hope because I know what that feels like. Amy smiled and held out her hand, and they shook on it, like equals making a deal between partners. Over the following weeks, Lyra healed in body and mind while learning how the ship operated and what the crew did. She discovered that the Morning Star was part of a larger network of human ships that traveled the outer rim buying slaves and setting them free. The Galactic Council called them pirates and criminals, but freed slaves called them heroes, and the name spread across 1,000 worlds. Lyra trained with weapons and learned basic ship systems and studied the slave trade routes that the crew had mapped over years of rescuing operations. Ember and Frost grew stronger on proper food and exercise, and they bonded with the other crew members who treated them with respect and kindness. By the time they reached Earth, Lyra had made her decision, and she told Captain Amy that she wanted to stay with the Morning Star permanently. The captain accepted her into the crew officially, and Lyra became part of the impossible work of doing what the galaxy said couldn't be done. Earth was unlike anything Lyra had imagined, with its blue oceans and green continents visible from space, and she pressed her face against the observation window while Ember and Frost chirped with excitement beside her. Captain Amy stood nearby and explained that humans called their world the cradle of humanity, and they protected it fiercely after learning what happened when species didn't value their home planets. The Morning Star landed at a massive spaceport outside a city called New Haven that had been built specifically for refugees and freed slaves from across the galaxy. Lyra walked down the landing ramp with her dragons and stared at the incredible mix of species living and working together without chains or cages or fear. Katie Miller offered to show her around the refugee center, and Lyra agreed because everything was overwhelming, and she needed a friendly guide. The center was huge, with housing and medical facilities and job training programs and schools for children who had been rescued from slavery. They walked past a Vortan family eating together at an outdoor cafe, and a group of Clixian younglings playing in a park, and nobody looked afraid or beaten down. Katie explained that Earth had 30 cities like this one spread across the planet, and more being built as human rescue operations brought home more freed slaves. But how do you pay for all this? Lyra asked, because feeding and housing millions of people couldn't be cheap. Katie smiled and said that humans believed society was judged by how it treated the most vulnerable, and they funded refugee programs through taxes and donations. Many former slaves stayed on Earth and became productive citizens who contributed back to the system, and others traveled to human colonies to start new lives. Lyra met dozens of freed elves over the next few days, and hearing their stories made her realize how many of her people had survived and found safety with humans. An older elf named Diana worked at the refugee center helping new arrivals adjust, and she hugged Lyra tight and welcomed her home, even though this wasn't their original homeworld. Diana explained that humans had tried to rescue elves from their burning planet, but the Kryn military had blocked access, and by the time human warships arrived, it was too late. The Council had condemned Earth for sending military vessels into Kryn space without permission, but humans had responded that they didn't need permission to stop genocide. That incident had made the relationship between Earth and the Galactic Council even worse. But humans seemed completely unbothered by the Council's disapproval. Lyra spent 2 weeks on Earth resting and healing and learning about human culture and history, and she discovered that their obsession with freedom and justice came from centuries of their own suffering. Katie took her to a museum about human slavery, and Lyra saw displays showing the horrors that humans had inflicted on each other before, finally deciding that all people deserved freedom. The museum didn't hide the ugly parts or pretend humans had always been good, and Lyra appreciated the honesty. She learned that humans had fought wars and held protests and written laws and changed their entire society because enough people decided that slavery was wrong. It took generations and cost millions of lives, but humans had succeeded, and now they wanted to help other species do the same. When it was time for the Morning Star to leave, Earth Lyra boarded with determination and purpose because she knew exactly what she wanted to do with her freedom. Captain Amy assigned her to work with Chen learning ship systems, and with Zara studying slave trade routes and security systems. Lyra proved to be a quick learner, and her experience as a slave gave her insights that helped the crew plan better rescue operations. Her dragons grew rapidly on Earth's rich atmosphere and proper nutrition, and they became formidable companions who could fight alongside Lyra if needed. The crew's next mission took them to Station 92 in Thalorian space, where intelligence suggested a large shipment of recently captured slaves would be sold. Amy called a meeting to plan their approach, and everyone contributed ideas while treating each other as equals regardless of species or how long they had been with the crew. Lyra suggested that she could pose as a slave being sold by Katie, which would let them get close to the holding area without raising suspicion. Amy considered it carefully and asked if Lyra was ready to put herself back in that position, even temporarily. Lyra touched the weapon on her belt and looked at her dragons and said she was ready, because this time she had backup and nobody could actually hurt her. The plan was approved, and 2 days later Lyra walked into Station 92 in chains with Katie pretending to be a slave dealer looking to sell exotic elven merchandise. The other crew members spread through the station in disguise, watching for trouble and ready to move if things went wrong. Lyra's heart pounded as they entered the slave market, and she saw rows of cages filled with terrified beings who had given up. Hope Katie played her role perfectly. As a cold businesswoman interested only in profit, and the dealers took them seriously, they were led to the holding area behind the public market where newly arrived slaves waited to be processed and sold. Lyra counted at least 50 prisoners from a dozen species, including 5 elves who looked like they had been captured recently. Katie loudly complained that the facilities were inadequate and demanded to inspect the security systems before agreeing to sell her merchandise here. The dealer, who was a Thalorian named Voss, was annoyed but agreed because Katie was offering high-quality goods, and he didn't want to lose the sale. While Katie kept Voss distracted with questions, Lyra memorized the layout and security measures and counted the number of guards. She made eye contact with one of the elven slaves and saw recognition flash in the woman's eyes, followed by confusion, because Lyra looked too healthy to be a real slave. Lyra gave the tiniest shake of her head, warning the woman to stay quiet, and the elf nodded almost invisibly. After an hour of inspection, Katie announced that she would sell her merchandise elsewhere because the security was inadequate for such valuable property. Voss tried to negotiate, but Katie was firm, and they left the holding area with Lyra still in chains playing her role. Once they were back on the Morning Star, the crew gathered to review what Lyra had learned and plan the actual rescue. Amy studied the security layout and decided they would move tonight before the slaves were transferred to the auction block tomorrow. Chen could disable the station's security systems remotely, giving them a 10-minute window before backup systems engaged. Zara and 2 other crew members would secure the holding area, while Katie and Lyra freed the prisoners. Amy and the rest would control the docking area and make sure their escape route stayed clear. Everyone checked their weapons and equipment while Lyra felt her hands shaking with nervous energy. Captain Amy noticed and put a hand on her shoulder and told her that fear was normal and smart, and that courage meant acting. Despite the fear, Lyra nodded and took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was doing this to help others escape the nightmare she had lived. At midnight station time, the Morningstar crew moved into position, and Chen triggered the security shutdown from the ship. The team moved fast through darkened corridors while chaos erupted as alarms failed and doors opened randomly across the station. They reached the holding area, and Zara's team secured the guards without killing them, because Amy had strict rules about using only necessary force. Lyra opened cage after cage, while Katie guided frightened slaves toward the exit and told them they were being rescued by humans. Some slaves were too scared to move, and others sobbed with relief, and everyone was confused, but they followed because what else could they do? The 5 elves recognized Lyra and trusted her word that these humans were different, and they helped calm the other species. They moved quickly through the station with Amy's team clearing their path, and within 8 minutes all 50 slaves were aboard the Morningstar. The ship broke dock and jumped to hyperspace before station security could respond, and they were gone, leaving only a message on every screen saying that slavery was a crime against all living beings. The 50 freed slaves filled the Morningstar's cargo bay that had been converted into temporary living quarters, and Lyra moved among them with Katie helping treat injuries and calm fears. Most of them couldn't believe they were actually free, and kept asking when the trick would be revealed or what price they would have to pay. Lyra understood that disbelief completely, because she had felt the same way when Amy rescued her from Station 47 months ago. She sat with the 5 elven women and learned their names and stories while Ember and Frost curled up nearby, radiating warmth and comfort. The oldest was named Helen, and she had been a teacher before the Kryn burned her village and took everyone who survived. The youngest was barely 16 and called herself Beth, and she cried quietly while Helen held her and promised they were safe now. Lyra told them about Earth and the refugee cities, and how humans had built entire communities dedicated to helping freed slaves start new lives. She showed them her weapon and explained that she was part of the crew now and spent her time rescuing others who needed help. Helen looked at her with wonder and asked how long Lyra had been free and whether she ever stopped feeling afraid. 6 months, Lyra answered honestly, and I still have nightmares, but they get better, and the humans have doctors who help with the mental scars too. Over the next 3 days of travel, the freed slaves slowly began to accept their new reality, and some even started to smile or laugh. Katie organized the crew to teach basic trade language to those who didn't speak it, and Chen showed the technically minded how ship systems worked. Captain Amy visited the cargo bay every day and talked to each person individually, learning their names and what they hoped to do with their freedom. Lyra watched her captain work and marveled at how Amy treated each freed slave with the same respect she showed her crew. The Morningstar stopped at a human outpost called Liberty Station to transfer the freed slaves to a transport ship heading to Earth. Lyra helped everyone prepare for the journey and promised the elven women that she would visit them on Earth when her missions allowed. Beth hugged her tight and whispered, "Thank you for coming back for us." And Lyra had to blink away tears. Helen gave her a small carved wooden pendant that she had somehow kept hidden during her captivity and told Lyra to stay safe. After the transport departed, Amy called a crew meeting to discuss their next mission, and Lyra was surprised when the captain asked for her input. Intelligence reports suggested a major slave auction happening in 3 weeks on Kryn Prime itself, and high-value prisoners from multiple species would be sold. Going to the Kryn homeworld was incredibly dangerous because their military presence was strongest there, and humans were definitely not welcome. But Amy pointed out that hitting them at home would send a message that nowhere was safe for slavers and might discourage the trade. Chen warned that Kryn Prime had serious security, including military patrol ships and planetary defense systems that could destroy them easily. Zara suggested they needed more ships and more crew for a mission this big, and Amy agreed. The captain contacted other human rescue ships in the network, and within 2 days, 5 vessels had agreed to join the operation. Lyra met crews from the Liberty Bell and the Harriet and the Lincoln, and the Exodus and the Sojourner, and all of them were commanded by former slaves who had dedicated their lives to freeing others. They gathered at a hidden base in an asteroid field to plan the most ambitious rescue operation humans had ever attempted. Plan was complex, with multiple teams hitting different locations simultaneously. To divide Kryn's security forces, Amy's team would target the main auction house where the high-value slaves were held. 2 other teams would hit secondary markets to free as many people as possible. The remaining ships would engage Kryn patrol vessels and keep them busy while the rescues happened. Everyone knew this mission was more dangerous than anything they had tried before, and casualties were possible. Captain, Amy made it clear that anyone who wanted to sit this one out could do so without judgment. Nobody backed out, and Lyra felt proud to be part of this impossible group of humans and freed slaves who refused to accept that some suffering was inevitable. They spent a week preparing and training and running simulations until everyone knew their role perfectly. Lyra worked with her dragons, teaching them hand signals for combat situations because they would be joining the fight this time. Ember had grown, large enough to carry supplies, and Frost could breathe a freezing mist that would disable enemies without killing them. The night before they departed for Kryn Prime, Katie found Lyra in the training room practicing with her weapon. The medic sat down and asked if Lyra was scared, and Lyra admitted that she was terrified. Katie nodded and said fear was good because it kept you alert, but you couldn't let it control your actions. She told Lyra about her own rescue 5 years ago when humans had freed her from a medical facility where she was being used for experiments. Katie had been so broken that she couldn't speak for months, but the humans had been patient and helped her heal. Now she used her medical knowledge to help others and turned her pain into purpose. Lyra understood that completely because that was exactly what she was doing with her own trauma. The fleet of 6 human ships jumped into Kryn space at coordinates far from normal traffic lanes and then split up to approach their targets from different directions. The Morning Star headed for Kryn Prime with 2 other vessels, while the rest moved to intercept patrol ships. Amy's voice came over the ship's intercom, calm and steady, as she reminded everyone of the plan and told them to trust their training. Lyra checked her gear one final time and hugged her dragons and whispered that they would save a lot of people today. The ship entered Kryn Prime's atmosphere and headed for the capital city where the auction house stood in the center of the government district. Chen had hacked into Kryn systems days ago and planted false data, showing the Morning Star as a registered cargo vessel making a delivery. They landed at a commercial port 3 blocks from the auction house, and the team disembarked in civilian clothing. With weapons hidden, Lyra wore a long coat that concealed her gear, and her dragons stayed close, pretending to be exotic pets. They split into 3 groups approaching the auction house from different directions and timing their arrival to hit simultaneously. Lyra's group included Amy and Katie, and 2 other crew members named Jake and Linda. They walked through crowded streets where Kryn citizens went about their daily lives, completely unaware that humans were in their capital city. The auction house was a massive building with ornate architecture that celebrated Kryn power and wealth, built on the suffering of slaves. Guards stood at every entrance, checking identification, and weapon scanners covered all approaches. But Chen's hacking had already compromised their security systems, and the scanners would show nothing wrong when the humans passed through. Amy led them confidently through the main entrance, and they presented false identification that Chen had created using real Kryn data. The guards waved them through without interest, and they entered the auction house where wealthy Kryn examined slaves displayed on elevated platforms. Lyra felt rage burning in her chest as she saw dozens of prisoners in chains being treated like merchandise. She forced herself to stay calm and follow the plan because losing control now would get everyone killed. They moved through the main hall toward the back areas where high-value slaves were kept in secure holding cells. 2 guards blocked the hallway to the restricted area, and Amy approached them with a credit chip and explained they wanted private viewing of premium merchandise. The guards checked their credentials, again, and accepted the bribe and led them deeper into the building. Once they were away from the public areas, Amy gave a hand signal, and the team moved with practiced efficiency. Jake and Linda disabled the guards quietly, while Katie pulled out a device that would jam communications for 10 minutes. Amy opened the first cell and found a Vorton family huddled together in fear. They whispered that they were being rescued by humans, and the Vortons stared in disbelief. Lyra opened the next cell and found 3 elven males who looked shocked to see another elf dressed as a free person. "We are getting you out," she said firmly, "and you need to trust us and move quickly." The team freed 28 slaves from the high-security area in less than 5 minutes. At the same moment, the other teams hit their targets and alarms started blaring throughout the city as Kryn security realized something was wrong. Alarms screamed through the auction house and Kryn security forces rushed toward the holding areas while Amy's team moved the freed slaves toward the emergency exit Chen had marked on their maps. Lyra stayed at the rear, protecting the group with her weapon ready while Ember and Frost flanked the slaves, keeping them moving forward. The first Kryn guards rounded the corner, and Lyra fired stunning rounds that dropped them without killing because Amy's rules about unnecessary force applied even here more. Guards poured into the corridor and Jake threw a flash device that blinded them temporarily, giving the group precious seconds to reach the
exit. They burst out into an alley behind the auction
house where Katie had a stolen transport vehicle waiting with the engine. Running, the 28 freed slaves crowded into the vehicle with the crew members while Lyra and Amy covered their escape from the building. Kryn military units were mobilizing across the city, and the sound of aircraft overhead meant they had very little time before the area was locked down. The transport raced through back streets following the route Chen had planned that avoided main security checkpoints. Lyra held onto a rail as the vehicle swerved around corners while freed slaves huddled together in fear and confusion. A Kryn patrol vehicle spotted them and opened fire with energy weapons that scorched the transport's armored sides. Amy leaned out and returned fire with precision, shots that disabled their engines without harming the occupants. 3 more blocks to the spaceport, Katie shouted over the noise, and Lyra could see smoke rising from other parts of the city where the other teams were causing chaos. They crashed through a security barrier at the commercial port and drove straight onto the landing pad where the Morning Star waited with ramps extended. Chen had the engines already running, and the moment everyone was aboard, the ship lifted off and climbed rapidly toward orbit. Kryn fighters launched to intercept, but the other human ships were waiting and engaged them in a running battle that let the rescue vessels escape. The Morning Star's hull shook as enemy fire grazed their shields, and Chen pushed the engines beyond safe limits to gain speed. Amy coordinated with the other ships over encrypted channels and confirmed that all teams had successfully extracted. With over 200 freed slaves total, the human fleet regrouped in orbit and jumped to hyperspace before Kryn capital ships could arrive to block their escape. Lyra slumped against a wall in relief while her dragons pressed against her sides, and the freed slaves stared around the ship in amazement. Katie immediately started treating injuries while other crew members distributed food and water and blankets over the next few days. As they traveled back to Liberty Station, Lyra talked with many of the freed slaves about their experiences. The 3 elven males she had found were brothers named Peter and Frank and George, who had been separated from their families during the Kryn invasion. They asked if other elves had survived, and Lyra told them about the communities on Earth and the hundreds of their people who had found safety with humans. A young Clixian named Tessa told Lyra that she had spent her whole life as a slave and never knew freedom was possible. She asked why humans cared so much about freeing slaves when it put them in danger. Lyra sat with her and explained what Captain Amy had taught her about humans refusing to accept that some suffering was acceptable. Humans remember their own history, Lyra said, and they decided to be the people their ancestors needed. When nobody came to help, the Kryn Empire formally complained to the Galactic Council about human aggression and demanded sanctions against Earth. The Council held emergency sessions, and several species supported Kryn's position because the raid on their homeworld was seen as unacceptable. Provocation, Earth's ambassador, gave a speech that became famous across the galaxy, saying that humanity would never apologize for freeing slaves and would continue rescuing those who needed help, regardless of council approval. The ambassador pointed out that the Kryn had invaded elven space and committed genocide while the council did nothing, stated that any government built on slavery and conquest had no moral authority to complain about aggression. Several species walked out of the council chamber in protest, but others quietly approached Earth afterward to discuss potential cooperation. The raid on Kryn Prime changed everything because it proved that humans would go anywhere and risk anything to free slaves. Slave prices dropped across the outer rim because dealers worried about human raids cutting into their profits. Some slave markets closed entirely and moved to hidden locations that were harder for human ships to find, but the human rescue network grew larger as more freed slaves joined the crews and more ships were built specifically for liberation missions. Lyra continued working with the Morning Star and became one of the most effective crew members because her experience as a slave gave her unique insights. Her dragons grew to full size and became formidable partners in rescue operations, with Ember providing aerial reconnaissance and Frost using his freezing breath to disable security systems. Captain Amy promoted Lyra to mission coordinator, and she helped plan raids across a dozen systems, freeing thousands of slaves over the following years. She never forgot the cold cage on Station 47 or the feeling of being abandoned by the galaxy. Every person they rescued was reminded that someone had crossed impossible distances just to bring them home. The elven refugees on Earth built memorials to the humans who had saved them and taught their children about the species that refused to look away. Other freed species did the same, and soon Earth became known as the sanctuary world where the hopeless found hope. The Galactic Council eventually changed its stance on slavery after years of pressure from Earth and allied species. They passed laws making the slave trade illegal in Council space, though enforcement was weak in the Outer Rim, but the laws mattered because they acknowledged that humans had been right all along about the moral implications of treating beings as property. Lyra stood on the observation deck of the Morning Star 10 years after her rescue and looked at the stars with Ember and Frost beside her. She thought about all the people they had saved and all the families reunited and all the chains broken. Katie joined her and they watched the stars together in comfortable silence. Do you think we have made a difference? Lyra asked. Katie smiled and said, every single person we freed thinks we made a difference. And that is enough. Lyra nodded because it was true that changing one life mattered, even if the galaxy still had so much suffering. She had learned from humans that you couldn't fix everything, but you had a duty to fix what you could. Morning Star received coordinates for another mission, and Amy called the crew together to plan their approach. Lyra listened to the briefing and studied the maps and calculated the risks. Then she checked her weapons and hugged her dragons and prepared to do what humans had taught her. She would cross the galaxy to save people who had given up hope. She would stand against empires that everyone else feared. She would prove that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible, because that was what humans did, and now it was what she did, too. The galaxy called them troublemakers and idealists and dangerous fools, but the freed slaves called them heroes and saviors, and proof that someone out there actually cared. Lyra had been alone in a cage with nobody coming to help until the day humans did the impossible. Now she spent every day making sure nobody else had to feel that abandoned. The Morning Star jumped to hyperspace toward their next mission, and Lyra smiled because she knew exactly who she was. She was someone who had been saved and now spent her life saving others. She was proof that hope could survive even in the darkest places. She was part of something bigger than herself, and she would never stop fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. The stars stretched past the window, and somewhere out there people waited in cages hoping for rescue. Lyra and her crew would find them because that was what humans had taught the galaxy. Nobody gets left behind and nobody suffers alone, and freedom is worth any price. That was the human way, and it had become her way too.